What if an extraterrestrial intelligence sought to communicate with us? Not through radio signals or cryptic symbols, but with a physical demonstration, a display of such astonishing precision, it would force us to reconsider the limits of what's possible. Earlier this year, something very much like that happened. Japan made history, but not just by landing on the moon. It's true, it did successfully put a spacecraft on the lunar surface for the first time, becoming only the fifth nation to do so after the USA, Russia, India, and China. But JAXA's mission was about something far more profound than just arriving. They performed a landing of such unbelievable accuracy, it was like shooting a single skin cell from London to Cairo and having it land on one specific grain of rice. Before the launch, this breathtaking objective of pinpoint engineering was a major topic of conversation. But after JAXA's craft touched down, the headlines on Earth took a different turn. The lander, nicknamed Moon Sniper for its surgical precision, had a core mission to prove just how accurate lunar landings could be. Because of this, the tiny spacecraft wasn't built to withstand the brutal cold of a lunar night. And yet, against all odds, it has now survived 3 of them, leaving scientists baffled. This incredibly tough little craft has repeatedly powered back on, sending back both scientific data and breathtaking images from the lunar landscape. Oh, and one more thing, it's doing all of this while sitting upside down. Join me on this upside-down journey as we explore the details of JAXA's first lunar landing, uncover what has kept the Moon Sniper alive through 3 lunar nights, and examine how such precise landings are set to revolutionize the future of exploring our celestial neighbor. The Smart Lander for Investigating Moon, SLIM. The Smart Lander for Investigating Moon, more commonly known as SLIM, or Moon Sniper, is a small, lightweight craft about the size of a standard passenger car. Its assignment is to study the makeup of olivine rocks found close to the Scioli crater, which is situated about 200 miles south of the Sea of Tranquility, the famous spot where Neil Armstrong took his small step. This specific landing site sits on debris that was thrown out from the nearby crater impact, giving scientists a special chance to study lunar rock without having to drill. By analyzing these rocks, JAXA hopes to learn more about the moon's origins, its deep interior, and how it was formed. SLIM also brought along 2 tiny lunar excursion vehicles called LEV-1 and LEV-2, which were designed to be deployed from the lander to gather their own data and pictures. Beyond its scientific goals, SLIM is also a technology demonstrator, meant to show off the latest progress in engineering and mission control. Its main purpose was to prove that a small exploratory craft could pull off extremely accurate lunar landing maneuvers. This ability would make studying the moon and other planets faster and more efficient by using a lighter, more precise system for exploration, one that's able to touch down in rugged, rocky areas that are simply too dangerous for larger, bulkier spacecraft. The historical context of lunar landings. To truly appreciate the importance of this feat, it helps to look at some history. To start with, it's crucial to realize that only around 43% of all attempts to land on the moon have ever succeeded. Past lunar missions faced huge challenges with landing accuracy, mostly because of the limits of technology and the difficult lunar environment. For example, the Soviet Union had to make 12 attempts before it finally managed to land Luna 9 on the moon. In a similar vein, NASA's Ranger series took 6 tries before it found success. The fact that the moon has no atmosphere means that landers have to depend entirely on their engine thrust to slow their descent, which makes it very hard to make fine adjustments to their path during the final landing stage. The vehicle has to land at almost 0 velocity to make sure none of the instruments on board are broken by the impact. Every single Apollo mission landed dangerously close to rocks, craters, or slopes that could have caused catastrophic damage, and they had very little ability to make adjustments in real time. Furthermore, all the Apollo missions landed on the near side of the Moon, near its equator, and in nearly ideal lighting to make the landing as safe as possible. The problem with this strategy, though, was that NASA kept sending its spacecraft to the same general area of the Moon, which meant that actual exploration of the surface was limited to that one landing zone. If we could create a spacecraft that can land in an incredibly precise target zone, we could then send it to explore any spot we choose. Scientists would be able to perform focused studies on different kinds of rocks and soils without having to rely on rovers to travel long distances. This would cut down on the complexity and cost of missions, while at the same time opening up new ways to explore parts of the Moon that were previously out of reach. The Moon Sniper mission came with a price tag of $100 million. To put that in perspective, the 4 lunar rovers created for Apollo 15, 16, and 17 cost $38 million to build back in 1972, which would be about $286 million today. More recent rovers, like India's Chandrayaan-2 and China's Chang'e 4, cost around $141 million and $180 million respectively. This is exactly what researchers are working so hard on, and they're making fantastic progress. The evolution of lunar landing accuracy. A landing footprint, which is also called a landing ellipse, is the term for the area of uncertainty for a spacecraft's landing spot on another world. Back in 1969, Apollo 11's target ellipse was 18.5 kilometers by 4.5 kilometers. Fast forward to 2013, and China's Chang'e 3 was launched with a landing ellipse of 6 kilometers by 6 kilometers. Then, in January 2024, a JAXA lander made Japan the 5th nation to successfully land on the Moon, touching down just 55 meters from the middle of its 100-meter by 100-meter target ellipse. That's a target zone that is 8,825 times smaller than the one for Apollo 11. Let's take a closer look at the technology that allowed this to happen. Moon Sniper was able to achieve its incredible landing accuracy because of its vision-based navigation system, which JAXA calls Smart Eyes. By constantly taking pictures of the Moon's surface as it descended, the spacecraft could figure out its own location in real time on orbital maps that were created using data from other lunar rovers, including NASA's LRO, India's Chandrayaan-2, and Japan's Selene. These positions were then checked against a larger map of its general area to find the precise landing spot. By analyzing these images in real time, Moon Sniper could correct its path literally on the fly, which allowed it to hit its target with surgical precision. Weighing only 200 kilos without its fuel, a successful landing for SLIM would prove that small, lightweight spacecraft can indeed carry out complex missions to explore the Moon. The unexpected outcome and resilience of SLIM. Except SLIM didn't quite stick the landing. While JAXA did manage to get the craft to its target, it somehow fell over at the very last second. But after such a perfect approach, what caused this major problem? On September 6, 2023, JAXA sent SLIM on its way to the Moon. It got into lunar orbit successfully on Christmas Day 2023 and finally started its landing sequence on January 18, 2024. As Japan watched the live-streamed approach, one member of the mission team described the descent to landing as a breathless, numbing 20 minutes of terror. As it was coming down to the lunar surface, one of SLIM's 2 main engine nozzles mysteriously broke off 50 meters above the Moon. This uneven thrust made the craft start moving sideways, and it tried but failed to correct this using its smaller thrusters. The truly amazing part is that SLIM was able to figure out what was wrong during its descent and find a safe place to touch down, which prevented a total crash. Slim ended up on its nose, as we can see in pictures taken by one of the two autonomous probes that Slim released just before it landed. We can see the box-shaped main vehicle on the moon's surface upside down, with its solar panels facing away from the sun instead of up where they should be. Without direct sunlight, it was only a matter of time before the craft would run out of power and shut down. Soon after landing, Slim sent back a mosaic picture of its landing area using its limited battery. With only 12% of its power left, JAXA decided to turn the craft off, hoping it might recover once the sun's angle changed. And indeed, exactly 10 days later, on January 29th, that's what happened. For 2 short days, Slim was able to power up using energy from the sun, which had moved its position in the lunar sky. But the excitement among the JAXA team didn't last long, as they knew the lunar night was coming, which would probably be the end for their amazing little spacecraft. The harsh reality of lunar nights present a massive obstacle for all missions to the moon. They are incredibly harsh, and it's quite normal for lunar craft to not survive them. For instance, the first U.S. vehicle to get to the moon in 50 years, the U.S. lander Odysseus, didn't wake up after a lunar night. Just like Slim, it had a problem during its approach and landed on its nose in early 2024. Even though it went into a hibernation mode for 3 weeks, it never turned back on. Because the moon has practically no atmosphere, there's nothing to keep its surface temperature stable. During a lunar day when the moon is facing the sun, temperatures can climb to 121 degrees Celsius. On the other hand, during a lunar night, the moon is in total darkness and temperatures drop to an average of 180 degrees. That's a pretty big temperature change for a small lander. What's more, days and nights on the moon aren't like the 12-hour cycles we have on Earth. They each last for 14 Earth days. That means a fortnight of scorching heat, followed by a fortnight of complete, freezing darkness. Slim wasn't built to survive a lunar night. So, on January 31st, the mission team put it into a hibernation state for the next 14 days. It wasn't expected to make it, but the hopeful crew decided they would try to get in touch after the sun came up again, just in case. A miraculous survival and continued exploration. On February 26, JAXA tried to make contact with Slim again, with very little hope. You can imagine their absolute shock and joy when Slim answered back. Their miracle moon sniper had made it through its first lunar night and started sending pictures back to Earth. And it gets even better. After 2 weeks of collecting data and images during its second lunar day, JAXA put Slim into hibernation once more. Making it through one lunar night is a huge accomplishment. Nobody thought Slim would survive a second one, but somehow it did. On March 21st, JAXA confirmed they had gotten more communication from Slim after its second lunar night. The same thing happened in late April, when even more pictures were sent back from the lunar surface after its third lunar night. Slim had completely beaten the odds, staying functional through extreme levels of heat and cold that would ruin most electronics not specially made for those conditions. Somehow, Slim was still able to send data and images after 3 lunar nights. These pictures of the nearby moon rocks will help scientists get a better picture of lunar geology. In one image, Slim took a close-up shot of a moon rock which they jokingly named Toy Poodle, using a special multiband camera. Even though it's a bit blurry, geologists can use this picture to tell the difference between the various materials that make up the rock, which gives them clues about how the moon was formed. After the 4th lunar night, JAXA tried once more to get in touch with Slim, but as of May 27th, they haven't been able to confirm that they've successfully communicated with the moon sniper. After all its heroic work, it's likely that it has finally gone silent for good. Even so, JAXA's first lunar landing is a massive step forward in interplanetary travel, showing that these kinds of pinpoint landings are possible and opening up a world of other possibilities. The future of lunar exploration. One very important area of interest for scientists is the South Pole Aitken Basin, where it's believed the moon's mantle was once exposed on the surface. NASA is also getting ready to go back to the moon in 2026 with the launch of their Artemis missions. Pinpoint landings, like the one that Moon Sniper pulled off, might be essential in helping us get to water ice that's in permanently shadowed areas, which up until now have been impossible to reach. Moon Sniper is a symbol of the amazing progress and new ideas we've come up with since the last lunar era of the late 1960s and early 1970s. As interest from both the public and private sectors in going back to the moon keeps growing, missions like Moon Sniper give us a peek at what the second lunar era might hold for us. If I were a superstitious man, I'd suggest being very careful about the names we give to space missions. When Russia named its first lunar mission in 47 years, it was first called Luna-Glob, which means Luna Sphere. But this name bothered Lev Zelensky, the scientific director of the Space Research Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences, because glob sounded too much like another Russian word, grob, which means coffin. Zelensky changed the mission's name to Luna 25, trying to connect it to the earlier Soviet Luna missions, which were the last successful Russian spacecraft landings on the moon. But maybe it was too late, and a bit of that original name stuck around, because it seems now that Luna Coffin was a much more fitting name for the doomed Luna 25. Come with us today as we look into the sad story of Russia's first moon mission since 1976. For a country that was once a world leader in the space race, what exactly went so wrong? A historical overview of the Russian space program. While we often talk about NASA or ESA missions, Russia's space program has been a major force throughout history. When Russia was a part of the USSR, it was the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, that started the space race in 1957. For a while, the Soviet space program went from one success to another. It was the Soviet Union that sent the first man into space, and the first woman, the first crew of more than one person, and the first dog. Their rockets were the first to break free of the Earth-Moon system, the first to hit the moon, the first to orbit the moon, and the first to take pictures of the moon's far side. Soviet cosmonauts did the first spacewalk, and the USSR launched the first space station. To many people watching, and definitely to the satisfaction of the Soviet leaders, it looked like the USSR was winning the space race. But under the surface, not everything was going as well as it looked. The Soviet Union also had the first death during a space mission when cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov's re-entry capsule parachute didn't open when he was returning to Earth. The only 3 men to have ever died in space were a crew of Soviet cosmonauts visiting that very first space station. Soviet launches were full of failures, but because they wanted to keep a good international image, especially when compared to their rival, the United States, the USSR just didn't report any of its failed missions to the moon. It acted like any rocket that didn't make it out of the atmosphere was never meant to be a moon mission in the first place. In truth, only about 34% of Soviet moon missions were successful, compared to America's 60% success rate on similar missions. America put the first man on the moon in 1969, and after that crowning achievement, both superpowers seemed to lose interest in keeping the race going, turning their space programs to things other than the moon. By the mid-1970s, Soviet cosmonauts had never walked on the moon itself. The USSR canceled all plans to do so, as the whole thing was finally seen as too expensive. And maybe more importantly, what was the point of going if they were only going to get there second? The rekindled interest in lunar exploration. With the start of the new millennium and after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, interest from around the world in exploring the moon has started up again. Scientists realized that the moon would be a great stepping stone for human space missions to Mars because of its many resources, like the recently found water ice, perfect for rocket fuel, air, and water, and its low gravity. Lunar resources started to get the attention of businesses for money-making reasons, and nations began thinking about putting permanent bases on its surface as a way to make a profit. And of course, there is still a huge amount of scientific research to be done there, attracting those who want to learn more about how the moon was formed and the cycles that control it. Russia's old rival, the USA, started to bring its space programs back to life. America started its Constellation program in 2005, saying it planned to go back to the moon. But now, other countries were getting involved too. India, which hadn't been a part of the first race to the moon, started its Chandrayaan program for lunar exploration in 2000. Governments all over the world thought that the benefits of going to the moon in this second rush were so big that countries that didn't take part would, in some way, fall behind. In the words of Israel's chairman, Krishnaswamy Kasturirangan, it is not whether we can afford it, it is whether we can afford to ignore it. Russia's efforts and setbacks in the new space race. Russia had no plans of being left out. It wanted to get back the Soviet legacy of space exploration. In fact, it got ahead of its rivals. Russia had already started thinking about a new lunar mission as early as the mid-1990s, when scientists Mikhail Marov and Eric Galimov showed their ideas to Roscosmos, Russia's newly reorganized space agency. Their Luna-Glob mission was approved and was first planned with many more parts, including a penetrator for seismic sounding, a lander, and an orbiter. But the project didn't have enough political support at first. It had its budget cut after the Russian financial crisis of 1998, when the ruble lost over 2/3 of its value in 3 weeks, and it was hit with delays that kept pushing it back and putting it on pause. The penetrator and orbiter were eventually cut, leaving just the lander as the mission plan was rethought to make it cheaper. Russia wanted to be a nationally known player in the space world, but didn't want to put a huge part of its budget into the plan. In 2005, Russia only put 20 billion rubles, or about $700 million USD, into its space industry, compared to the USA's $15.6 billion. One way to get around this was to work with other nations. Russia first tried to work with India on the Chandrayaan-2 mission in 2007. Luna 25 would fly with India's orbiter and be the mission's lander. But this low spending ended up hurting them, and Russian scientists couldn't get the lander's technology working in time for the first 2013 launch date. India eventually gave up on the partnership and finished Chandrayaan-2 on its own. Russia was left trying to send Luna 25 to the moon's surface by itself. India's Chandrayaan-2 lander crashed into the moon, but India was ready to try again with Chandrayaan-3. This put Russia and India on a path from working together to being competitors. Both Russia and India were interested in the moon's south pole, where Chandrayaan-2 and other missions had confirmed that there was water ice through spectrometry. Luna 25 and Chandrayaan-3 were now in a race to be the first lander to successfully touch down on the moon's south pole and maybe find that water ice. The impact of geopolitics on space missions. But Russia had a new problem: the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Western countries were furious about Russia's choice to attack its neighbor and together put huge sanctions on it. Not only was this painful for the economy, but one very important part of these sanctions was a ban on the trade of high-end computer chips and components. These rules were meant to stop Russia from making high-precision ballistic rockets for the military, but also had a big impact on Russia's dreams for the moon. European scientists started ending their work with Roscosmos. In a connected world where Russia depended on international trade for many of its high-tech parts, Russia would now have to go it alone. India finished Chandrayaan-3 and launched it on July 14, 2023, a mission we talked about in more detail in another video. But the path they took to the moon was fuel-efficient, but not time-efficient. It would take more than a month to actually get to the moon's surface. India thought it would touch down on August 23rd. If Russia acted fast, it could finish its lander and get there before India by taking a shorter, more fuel-heavy path using Russia's powerful Soyuz 2.1B rocket. The Luna 25 mission had, by this time, been delayed from 2021 to 2022, and then to 2023. In a bad turn of events for Russia, its BIP navigation sensor failed quality tests. This was a problem because the BIP sensor needed a computer chip that was usually supplied by the West, a chip that Russia couldn't buy anymore because of Western sanctions. So Russian scientists had to make a new one on their own. The BIP-less Luna 25 was approved for launch on August 11, 2023. It had 8 Russian scientific instruments on board, including laser mass spectrometers, infrared spectrometers, cameras for taking pictures of the lunar surface, and even a device for measuring dust and micrometeoroids. Luna 25 was made to work on the moon's surface for a whole year, surviving the freezing cold of lunar night and the strong solar radiation of lunar days. It had the potential for big scientific discoveries. The Soyuz rocket was strong enough to get Luna 25 to the moon's surface by August 23rd, 2 vital days before India's lander arrived. Russia would indeed win the race against its rival. Luna 25's demise. Luna 25 launched successfully from the Vostochny Cosmodrome on August 11, 2023, and went into lunar orbit on August 16th. It took pictures of the moon's surface, getting an image of the Zeeman crater. All systems were working as they should, and communications were good. Russian scientists then started to make the final plans for the landing itself. The moon's south pole has some dangerous terrain, and the scientists wanted to avoid a rough landing that could possibly hurt Luna 25. But then something went wrong. On August 19th, Luna 25 lost contact with Earth. No longer being guided from afar, Luna 25 tried to do its pre-planned move that would take it from a circular orbit around the moon into the new path towards the surface. But more problems happened. The BIP navigation device, the one made by Russian scientists after the last one, had failed quality control tests, sent the wrong information to the ship's onboard control unit. Because of this, the thrusters fired for 127 seconds instead of the planned 84 seconds, pushing Luna 25 into a steeper and steeper descent. On August 20th, Luna 25 fell toward the moon's surface at a speed that couldn't be controlled. Roscosmos scientists could only watch in horror as the lander sped into the terrain, going faster and faster. Even though no outside cameras saw the impact, it's easy to picture the grim result of gravity turning Luna 25 back into a Luna coffin. Its lunar mission hadn't lasted a year, but only a few days. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter later flew by, taking a picture of the craft's final resting place. Luna 25 had hit hard, making a crater about 10 meters across. Russia had tried to show the world that it was still a great power in space exploration, but Luna 25 had been hit by pressures and problems. Western sanctions had indirectly sabotaged it. The Russian replacement chip wasn't accurate enough, or maybe not strong enough, to handle the high radiation environment of space. Lessons from Luna 25, but Russia's attempt to beat its rival India had also made problems for itself. Its arrival date being 2 days before India's reminded me of a similar event when the Soviet Union's Luna 15 mission crashed into the moon only a few hundred miles away, and on the same day Apollo 11 landed. Luna 15 was supposed to collect moon rocks, just like the Apollo 11 astronauts. Even though it was uncrewed, if America's mission had failed, it would have been a point of pride for the Soviet Union that Luna 15 had managed to steal America's thunder. This was about scoring political points. The Soviet Union didn't just want to get to the moon, it wanted to get there first. Naturally, when you're racing to beat someone else, you spend less time making sure everything works as it should, which makes the risk of failure higher. In the end, just like with Luna 15, Russia's Luna 25 had the opposite effect that its country's leaders wanted. Instead of showing Russia's superiority in space exploration, it showed the problems of isolationism and rivalry over working together. If Russia had kept working with groups like ESA and shared in technological progress, maybe it would be celebrating a success right now. In many ways, it's a tragedy. Maybe this can one day change the future of humanity. Our path seems to lead to the stars. If we are to do well in space, it will be because we, as a world, work together. The tragic end of the Luna 25 mission can and should be a learning experience, not just an embarrassing note in history, but only if the right lessons are learned from it. Pride is not always a good thing. Rivalry can lead to isolation when it's not needed, and can get in the way of careful thinking. While it's not likely, it would surely be nice if our attempts to prove we are better than each other could finally be put to rest, buried in a frozen coffin on the lunar surface. The Moon, Earth's own natural satellite, orbits about 384,000 kilometers from us, a celestial body that people have watched for millennia, using its predictable movements to mark time in calendars. Its reliable rhythms helped ancient peoples know the best times to plant their crops, and its waxing and waning phases have made the moon a powerful symbol in our stories and traditions. It is a marvel, a tool, and a curse. While the moon's stark beauty has inspired poets, it also brings devastation. There is one lunar rhythm that is not a friend to us, a 19-year cycle that triggers unexpected floods and destruction. NASA scientists are worried that in the mid-2030s, this cycle is set to have its worst impact yet. For ecosystems that are properly adjusted to it, this won't be a problem. But how well adjusted are we? Join us today as we look into the innocently named lunar nodal cycle and discover why we must quickly get a much better grasp of our moon's shifting behavior if we hope to shield ourselves from the dangers it holds. The moon's impact on Earth and the lunar nodal cycle. Just like the sun, the moon is a part of life on Earth we can't escape. The moon has a huge effect on our planet. You've probably already heard how its cycles guide our wildlife, shape our climate, and pull our tides. We often think that the gravities of the moon and Earth make them orbit each other in a fairly stable, synchronized dance. But as is often true, nature isn't as simple as we might think. Instead, every 18.6 years, the moon's orbit goes through a slight change, a shift in its position between us and our sun that makes high tides swell even higher, pushing us into dangerous flood territory. But let's look at what this slight change involves. Its name is the lunar nodal cycle, or the precession of lunar nodes. This complicated name points to a specific feature of the Moon's orbit around the Earth. You probably know that every 29.5 days, the Moon circles the Earth. But this orbit isn't perfectly flat. To be exact, there's a 5-degree difference between the angle of the Moon's orbit and the ecliptic plane, the flat surface on which the Earth orbits the Sun. For half of the month, the Moon is a little above the ecliptic plane. For the other half, it's a little below it. This means there are 2 points where it crosses over, or 2 nodes, an ascending node and a descending node, that show the point where the Moon moves from one side to the other, and it's these nodes that slowly move over the course of the 18.6-year cycle, turning in one full circle around the planet. Understanding tides and the nodal cycle's influence. The nodes themselves are what create the problem. To see why, let's review what we know about tides. You might already know how the Moon's gravity pulls Earth's water towards it, making a bulge in sea levels on the side nearest to it, which we call high tide. You probably also know that this happens on the side of the planet farthest from the Moon too. Instead of being just from gravity, this second bulge is caused by centrifugal forces, as the Earth and Moon pulling on each other makes them act like 2 dancers holding hands and spinning around a dance floor. While it's mostly the Moon that moves because of Earth's much bigger mass, the Earth is also swung around a bit. The water on the backside is therefore trying to fly off into space because of this rocking motion, which makes the second high tide. The Sun also has a part in making tides, though a smaller one. It has a bigger mass, which would create a bigger pull if it were closer, but because it's farther away, the Sun's effect is only 1/3 as strong as the Moon's. When the Moon and the Sun are lined up, we get especially large tides called spring tides. This happens 6 to 8 times a year. When they aren't lined up, their gravitational pulls partly cancel each other out, which leads to smaller tidal differences known as neap tides. Now think about how the lunar nodes affect this tidal tug-of-war. During spring tides, the combined pull of the Sun and the Moon working together causes the highest tides and the biggest risk of floods. But the Sun and the Moon are never more lined up than they are at a node. During the rest of each 9.3-year phase, they aren't pulling in quite the same direction, so tides are more moderate. It's at a node that things get more serious, and the danger of floods becomes greatest. The last time this alignment happened, in September 2015, the UK and the US both gave major flood warnings to their people. In September itself, there were floods, though they were minor, but it was only when heavy rain mixed with the power of the lunar nodes a couple of months later that the real damage was done. In the U.S. in October, South Carolina had flash flooding that caused property damage and needed emergency services to rescue people. At the end of December 2015, the UK was hit by some of the worst floods it had seen in 100 years. Combined with the power of Storm Desmond, flooding and storm damage caused an estimated $1.3 billion in damages. The looming crisis, lunar nodal cycle, and climate change. These floods can cause a lot of damage, but that alone doesn't fully explain why NASA is worried about the next alignment in the mid-2030s. There is another factor at play besides the regular rhythm of this rising flood risk we've seen throughout human history. Sadly, the next nodal alignment with the Sun is expected to be especially destructive. The danger comes from this event combining with the system that is already under stress, even more stress than it was in 2015. Climate change has caused sea levels to rise steadily. When the next node lines up with the Sun in the mid-2030s, this will likely cause a huge increase in floods on planet Earth. Worryingly, a new study led by NASA's Sea Level Change Science Team says that almost all U.S. mainland coastlines, Hawaii and Guam, will see a massive jump in the number of floods when this happens. Some forecasts say this nodal alignment could cause 4 times the amount of flooding from one decade to the next, which will damage infrastructure and change our coastlines all over the world. This means human life will surely be affected by these floods, impacting shelter, clean water, electricity, as well as a higher risk of waterborne diseases like hepatitis A and cholera breaking out. Also, when floodwaters go down, they can leave behind stagnant pools where mosquitoes breed, possibly spreading other diseases like malaria. This has a ripple effect on economic problems, as these natural events can make coastal life unaffordable, with higher insurance costs on homes or not being able to get insurance at all, which could lead to lower property values in affected communities. As a result, this lunar nodal cycle will lower the quality of life in coastal communities where infrastructure might not be rebuilt or adapted to this force of nature. It's not just bad for humans. Ilya Rashin, a visiting professor at Rutgers University, found that the peak of the lunar wobble, where high tides are higher, can drown salt marshes. Salt marshes are homes for many kinds of species, like invertebrates, and these floods can cause these creatures to drown, which means that other species like fish, seabirds, and others that need invertebrates to survive also suffer. And they aren't the only ones that depend on salt marshes, as salt marshes are home to a lot of marine life, including 75% of all fishery species. This means that the lunar wobble affects the food chains of both humans and animals, disrupting their natural homes and affecting their populations. Potential solutions and adaptation. While all of this might sound pretty grim, it's interesting that not all ecosystems on the planet are hurt by flooding and high tides. Ecologist Neil Sabin of Macquarie University found that the lunar nodal cycle has a big impact on the expansion and shrinking of mangrove canopy cover across most of Australia. The study showed that the peaks of the lunar nodal cycle happened at the same time as an increase in mangrove canopy cover. It showed that when the lunar wobble is at its lowest phase, it makes mangrove ecosystems very dry, which leads to thinner canopy cover. But when the lunar wobble is at its highest phase, mangrove cover increases. Mangrove canopies are good for Earth's environment because they are complex ecosystems that fight climate change, protect wildlife, and shield coastlines. They can also absorb 4 times as much carbon dioxide as rainforests of the same size. Their growth is vital to the well-being of our planet, so it's not all bad news. Still, it's obvious that if we don't plan for it, coastal cities and environments will face a major crisis. Your important question then is, what can we do about it? One way is better protection. As said before, protecting and restoring mangroves can act as a shield against flooding, as they can lessen the vulnerability of coastal communities. More specifically, mangroves can prevent damage by lowering the height and energy of waves as they go through mangrove forests. The above-ground roots and branches reduce the height of the waves, making them lose energy and finally stopping them from covering the seabed and sediments. The mangrove roots and branches also reduce wind energy, which can stop waves from forming. According to reports, densely packed mangroves can cut the height of a wave in half after just a 100-meter passage. For comparison, in an open forest where roots and branches are more spread out, it would take 500 meters for a wave to cut its height in half. So saving and replanting these mangroves, or plants with similar abilities, can become a strong shield against the coming floods. Another possible answer is to learn to live with these flood-prone conditions, working with nature instead of against it. For example, let's look at the flood defenses in the Netherlands, where 1/3 of the country is below sea level and another third is in danger of flooding. They've built infrastructure that works with water and manages rising sea levels, They do this by designing things like polders. Polders are pieces of land below sea level that have been taken back from a body of water. They are always fully or partly surrounded by an embankment to keep water out from either the sea or a river. These polders have a network of drainage canals and pumps to control water levels by getting rid of extra water and sending water back to the sea or river to make sure the water does not overflow the land. Polders can be used to protect houses, farms, and factories, and are therefore used a lot throughout the country. The Netherlands also built dams and used sand dunes to find ways to stay dry in their swampy land. This shows that there are ways we can watch nature and live with it. So the bad news is that under its heavenly beauty, our moon hides a power that, if combined just right, is set to swamp humanity's coastal homes. But there's always a bit of good news. Knowledge itself is a power. By understanding our situation, we can look for answers, both among ideas we already have and through paths we have yet to find. If we are to handle what's coming, it's high time for us to use our natural creativity and drive to adapt and survive, to work with our planet instead of against it. On March 4, 2022, an unidentified rocket booster crashed into the moon's surface. This event was watched by the scientific community, which had been following the booster since 2015 as it silently circled our planet. When it hit, it created a strange double crater that didn't match any previous observations or have an easy explanation. Yet other people watching were more interested in where it came from, who had launched it. No country took responsibility. My first thought when I heard this was of secret government programs or shady companies launching pirate satellites to make a quick buck. But as I looked into it, the source of this mystery rocket actually opened my eyes to an unexpected problem, one that was very concerning. It points to a quickly approaching time where, instead of being a place of peaceful exploration, space might become filled with danger and conflict. Hopefully this can be avoided, but the first step is to understand what is happening up there. Join us today as we uncover the likely origins of this rocket and the troubling implications its existence has for space exploration in general. Unraveling the mystery, the origin of WE-913A. To start figuring out where the rocket booster, known as WE-913A, came from is actually one of the easier parts of this puzzle. And no, it's probably not a discarded piece from a secret government program. While I'll admit I don't have inside information about the secret space programs of every nation in the world, it turns out that secret space launches are surprisingly hard to pull off, which makes this explanation unlikely. This is because for the last 70 years, since the intercontinental ballistic missile was invented, countries have become very invested in knowing when other nations are launching rockets. The great fear during the Cold War was that America and Russia would launch nuclear missiles at each other, so it was a matter of survival for each to know about the other's activities. They did this with radar, but also with spy networks. When Russia launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, American intelligence already knew about it, even if they didn't share this information with the American public. Since then, radar systems and satellites have become so advanced that they can spot launches within minutes. It's almost impossible now to send a rocket into the sky without someone seeing it. Rockets, after all, are pretty hard to hide. And even if you did manage to launch it without being seen, space is incredibly huge and open. Even if governments missed it, amateur astronomers all over the globe watch the skies as a hobby. It wouldn't take very long for someone to spot it. You'd probably have better luck disguising your secret spacecraft as something it wasn't. Maybe by launching it disguised as a harmless satellite, or letting it look like simple space junk falling off a rocket. You could then let it float through space in plain sight, yet hidden. If our mystery rocket were something like that, it might make more sense. However, we likely know its real origin thanks to a bit of math. Independent astronomers as far back as 2015 had watched the path of the mystery rocket, and by plotting its course, were able to work out the reverse of its path. By doing this, they could figure out which nations it had passed over at different times in its past. While this first made them think it was a stage of a SpaceX rocket, this idea was later replaced by a much more likely explanation that it had been part of the Chinese Chang'e 5T1 mission. The mystery rocket's orbit passed over China on the same day as the Chang'e 5T1 launch and matched its path extremely well. There was more proof. University of Arizona students at the Space Domain Awareness Lab used a Raptor telescope to do a spectroscopic survey of the mystery rocket. Basically, by looking at it through a telescope and checking the type of paint used on it from the light bouncing off its surface, they were able to compare it to existing records and see that it was a closer match to China's rocket style than SpaceX's. These supporting pieces of evidence led astronomer Jonathan McDowell to say he was 90% sure that the mystery rocket had belonged to China. China's denial and the ambiguity of space law. But China said no. When asked by journalists, Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said, according to China's monitoring, the upper stage of the Chang'e 5 mission rocket had fallen through the atmosphere in a safe manner and burned up completely. China's aerospace endeavors are always in keeping with international law. Some astronomers think China was just honestly mistaken here. It's also possible that China wasn't being truthful. But if the evidence is so strongly against them, why deny it? It's maybe that last line that gives the vital clue. China does not want to be seen as breaking international law. And this is where I start to get annoyed, not just with China, but with something that is a worldwide problem. You might not know that international space law does exist, though it is a bit incomplete. It's made up of a number of treaties that different countries have signed and agreed to over the years, like the Rescue Agreement, which highlights nations' duties to help astronauts in trouble, if they can, or the Outer Space Treaty of 1963, which puts into international law the right of all nations to explore space, makes states responsible for all space-related activities of their citizens, and says that space objects like the moon should only be used for peaceful purposes. It is the treaty that stops any nation from putting nuclear weapons in space, which is probably why there are no orbiting satellites with nuclear weapon platforms up there today, ready to rain down destruction on the planet. It makes states liable for damages that they cause in space, and requires them to avoid harmful contamination of celestial objects. It's likely this last rule that China's trying not to get in trouble for. While there was probably little harm done by the mystery rocket crashing into the moon, it's not a good look to accidentally lose track of your rocket stages and have them crash into things later. If any bacteria were on the rocket that could cause contamination, that's even worse. If the rocket part had crashed into a satellite, or if there one day are lunar bases on the moon and the rocket part had hit one of those, then it would have meant China had broken international law. The looming threat of space conflict. But why do I think that this will lead to a time of conflict? After all, while it's disappointing, it's certainly not that surprising for a nation to try to hide things to get an advantage or to avoid looking bad. And I have a problem with more than just the fact that there's more and more space debris circling in space, although this is becoming a bigger problem. No, the real reason for alarm is the fact that space law is so unregulated that a rocket's origin was a mystery to begin with. International law right now is not enough to make sure space is explored peacefully in the years to come. What's there is noble, but full of holes and unclear points. Let's take, for example, the Outer Space Treaty, one of the main treaties for the peaceful use of space, signed by 117 countries around the world, including the US, China, Russia, and basically anyone else with a space program. It says that outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. But this is actually being somewhat ignored. How does this idea fit with the wishes of a growing number of nations to set up bases and mine places like the moon? If you set up a base on a planet or moon, that certainly sounds like you're trying to stake a claim to at least part of it, which looks a lot like claiming sovereignty. Claiming resources certainly seems to me to be appropriation. The Artemis Accords, signed by 23 countries now, try to get around this by having signers legally state that they are not appropriating any of the resources they take from the moon. But other nations argue that this is nonsense. The American view has been seen by some as just a new version of the enclosure movement of Britain in the 18th century, where Britain simply claimed land as its own. Depending on which legal view wins in the end, there is a risk that any nation trying to claim resources from the moon might be breaking international law. But clearly, this is not slowing anyone down. Also, think about the Outer Space Treaty's rule about space being a place for peaceful purposes. No nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction are allowed in space. But this only applies to weapons of mass destruction, which leaves a lot of room for weapons of middling destruction or lower, and such ideas are currently being looked at. In 2003, a full 40 years after the Outer Space Treaty was signed, the U.S. Air Force suggested an idea of putting 20-foot-long tungsten rods, nicknamed rods from God, into orbital launches that could fire them from space. These falling rods would come down at speeds reaching Mach 10, hitting with the force of a small tactical nuclear weapon, but without the radiation. They would launch much less detectably than a missile, arrive in half the time, and would be almost impossible to stop. Luckily, instead of rods, it was the idea that was dropped, as it was seen as too expensive, but not because it broke international law. With civilization's growing dependence on satellites for business, communication, banking, navigation, and many other things, weapons in space are becoming more common. Satellites are increasingly becoming a weak point in a nation's security. Various nations are making anti-satellite missiles, ASATs, or defenses against ASAT missiles to threaten others' interests and protect their own. This is a complex problem, but one that has unexpected dangers. Space conflict of this kind is not as simple as you might think. When Russia tested one such ASAT missile on a test satellite of its own, it sent thousands of pieces of debris into orbit around the planet. Some of these pieces could stay in space for years, and if they hit other debris or satellites, those in turn could break, creating a cascade effect known as Kessler syndrome. If such conflict became widespread, it could mean the end of satellites in space for everyone. Interestingly, Russia and China have supported a treaty known as PEROS, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space, that bans all weapons in space of any kind, but this is being blocked by the U.S., who prefer the approach laid out by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt: speak softly and carry a big stick. Arguably, some force in space might actually be needed, which makes the situation even more complex. To say that there is a lack of trust between the major superpowers right now might be a bit of an understatement. Beyond that, in January 2018, a U.S. company called Swarm was denied permission by the U.S. Federal Communications Commission to launch 4 satellites. Swarm went ahead and launched them anyway in India without government permission. There were legal consequences for this. The FCC later fined Swarm $900,000 for their actions. But it sets a worrying precedent. As space becomes more and more accessible to companies with a lot of money and few morals, it may one day become profitable to take part in illegal space ventures. Some level of policing backed by some level of force might become necessary to protect the interests of legitimate or scientific spacefarers. Sadly, as has been noted by many analysts, there is a clear preference from countries on all sides for rules that promote freedom for their own actions while limiting the activities and goals of others. And yet, space needs greater global regulation. If the nations of the world cannot agree on some kind of framework for future exploration, there is a risk that space exploration becomes a Wild West, filled with conflict and with the more noble goal of scientific advancement left behind. This would be a waste, as with a little extra effort, international law could become strong enough to prevent this. A call for greater collaboration and regulation. What has been agreed on so far shows promise. One treaty, known as the Moon Treaty, lays out the environment of the Moon as the common heritage of mankind, to be used only for peaceful purposes and only to be exploited with careful agreement, according to an international regulatory regime. However, not many nations have signed up to this treaty, none of the nations that have significant launch capabilities, such as the US, Russia, or China, which makes this treaty mostly ineffective. There has so far not been any agreement on what this regime would look like, nor what the common heritage of mankind actually means. If space is to be a safe place for future generations, this needs to change. More discussion needs to happen on these topics to stop future illegal activity or escalating space-based arms races. Groups that send rockets into space need to keep track of them. In the end, the nations of the so-called civilized world need to come to more agreement on these issues. At the end of the day, we don't want to live in a world where we have mystery rockets crashing into the moon. We want to live in a world where space is appreciated for its alien beauty, where its dangers and mechanisms are purely natural and understood, and the moons and planets out there can be explored peacefully and fairly, rather than fought over and ultimately destroyed. Perhaps as a people we need to grow up, not just technologically but civilly too. Humanity has always embraced new frontiers. In the 16th century, when Christopher Columbus first sailed to America, thousands of Europeans set out on a dangerous 6-month journey across treacherous oceans to follow him. When they arrived, they knew that none of the comforts of European civilization would be there for them. They would have to farm, build shelters, and work tirelessly just to survive. Many didn't make it, either dying during the crossing or in the years after they arrived. But it didn't stop more from coming. It couldn't. The pull of the new frontier was too strong. Fast forward to the 21st century, and a new frontier lies before us: space. Despite its beauty, it is the most hostile environment you can imagine. Space will burn you to death. It will freeze you. Its radiation will kill you. The changing gravity will crush you or cause you to waste away. Not even breathable air can be taken for granted. Yet this frontier is calling to us. Perhaps it shows something deep in human nature, that we would try to go to such a desolate place. Maybe we love the challenge. There is something that speaks to certain souls about going somewhere hostile and deadly, and building something warm and safe there. Or maybe it's curiosity. There is so much to learn about the universe around us, and while looking at photographs and measuring conditions with instruments is interesting, there is nothing quite like experiencing a place, a phenomenon, a wonder of the universe for yourself. Plus, being there in person opens up completely new kinds of science. And so humanity's eyes are set on the other planets in our solar system. Humans might walk on Mars as early as 2033, But it starts with the moon. The Artemis mission plans to return humans to the moon by 2024. By doing so, it will develop new technology and explore technical frontiers that are currently unknown. The technical knowledge gained from this effort will allow scientists to create spaceships that can carry human life to the wider solar system. It starts with the moon and with Orion 1. Join us today as we look into the details of the recent successful splashdown of the first crew-capable spacecraft to travel to the moon and back in nearly 50 years. This mission will open the door to distant planets. So, what did it accomplish over its nearly 26-day journey? The answer gives us a fascinating look into how close we are to having humans on the moon once more. Orion 1's historic journey and objectives. Orion 1's journey to the moon and back began at Launch Complex 39B at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The feeling there was tense but exciting. This was a vital mission. It had been almost 50 years since the end of the last space race. But just like that previous one, America is not the only one trying to reach the moon's surface. The Chinese National Space Administration landed a rover on the far side of the moon in 2019, and they have recently developed a rocket, the Long March 9, that could possibly carry a human to the moon in the 2030s. NASA is nothing if not competitive. They hope to be the first ones back up there. For that to happen, Orion 1's mission would need to go well. The journey was carefully planned as a complex retrograde orbit, meaning it would travel in the opposite direction to the moon's orbit around the Earth, swinging around the moon 3 times, 2 of which would be close flybys. But this was more than just an attempt to thread the celestial needle. Besides flying accurately, Orion 1 would be thoroughly testing the various onboard systems needed to support human life on such a journey. Many parts had to work perfectly. A single failure could be fatal for anyone on board. Of course, Orion 1 was not carrying human passengers for this trip. That would be saved for the later Artemis 2 mission. That being said, there were passengers of a different kind. Introducing Commander Munikin Campos. Munikin Campos is a mannequin dummy with radiation sensors made to record the levels of cosmic exposure astronauts might face inside Orion 1's crew module. The name is a tribute to Arturo Campos, an electrical engineer who played a key role in saving the Apollo 13 mission by designing a fix after its oxygen tank ignited. A wonderful nod. I especially like the name Munikin. Munikin was joined by 2 other mannequins built for a similar purpose but representing different body types and genders, as female astronauts will be going into space as part of later Artemis missions. It's crucial to understand how space travel affects them specifically. The clothing these mannequins wear and Orion itself will need to protect the mannequins from cosmic radiation. Most agencies say that 50 MSV is the maximum safe amount of radiation a person can be exposed to in a year. On the moon, levels can get as high as 380 MSV. If NASA cannot lower these exposure levels to more manageable amounts, it will pose serious health risks for any future astronauts. Launch and early mission tests. Orion 1 launched. This was the first flight for both the spacecraft and the rocket carrying it. The Super Heavy Lift Space Launch System, SLS rocket, is NASA's tallest and most powerful rocket to date, and currently the most powerful in the world, providing 3.8 million kilos of thrust at launch and able to lift nearly 70,000 kilos and send it on its way to the moon, useful for carrying Orion 1 along with the 10 CubeSats that NASA would be using to monitor space conditions for future missions. Although it was initially delayed, Orion finally ignited, soaring through and out of the atmosphere before detaching from its other stages and starting its journey. And as a personal note, I have never seen a rocket launch quite like this one. The sheer power seen in the video is simply incredible. I've watched many rocket launches in my time, but this one was jaw-dropping. The first phase of the flight had started. It would take 4 days to get to the moon, but NASA had no plans to waste that time. Immediately, on the very first day of space travel, they began testing. And surprisingly, this meant it was time to turn on Alexa. Yes, Alexa made it on board as part of a partnership with companies Amazon, Cisco, and Lockheed Martin as part of Orion 1's Callisto payload. This payload is a set of video conferencing and voice command technology, funded by the companies as an attempt to show how useful such software could be as part of NASA's initiatives. Technicians on Earth were able to call Orion 1 and speak to Alexa, asking her to access information on telemetry and flight status. It's an interesting use of the technology being shown. One day, perhaps just like in science fiction, all of spaceship control will be voice-activated. On the third day of Orion 1's journey, after some course corrections had been made and it was well on its way to the moon, Orion 1 did a visual check of itself. There was always the risk of micrometeoroids hitting Orion 1's surface, and taking these photos would let NASA confirm how much damage was caused by this potential cosmic threat. It served as a reminder of one of the potential dangers Orion 1 would face. Luckily, while results are still being looked at, it seems that micrometeoroid impact damage was minimal on this trip. In those first days of travel, Orion 1 took pictures of planet Earth shrinking as the spacecraft traveled further away. It also began to look ahead. This first lunar flyby was important. Orion 1 would be passing over sites visited by the spacecraft before it, such as Tranquility Base, where Apollo 11 landed, or the sites of Apollo 12 and Apollo 14. Traveling close to the lunar surface would be an excellent dry run, great practice for any future missions where cargo or people need to be deployed. But it also showed one of the most important and repeatedly tested parts of Orion 1's flight: its autonomy. For 15 minutes, the moon's mass would block communication with Earth. NASA is very concerned with astronaut safety, so they have worked hard on developing backup systems into Orion 1. But what would happen if Orion 1 ever lost contact with Earth and had to navigate on its own? You can't just open Google Maps when you're traveling 210 kilometers an hour over 370,000 kilometers from Earth. Although they did test GPS connectivity during this mission just in case. Like sailors crossing the seas in ancient times, Orion 1 would need a compass to help it find its way. Its method for doing this was actually very similar to those sailors. Orion 1 can navigate by using the stars. The spacecraft has an optical navigation camera designed to use the position of the stars to track its position, orientation, and motion in space at any given time. By comparing what it sees with onboard digital star maps at many points on this journey, scientists tested systems related to making sure this capability worked and wouldn't be hurt by anything space had to throw at it, such as the warping effects of solar heat. Luckily, these systems all worked perfectly. Orion 1 was able to keep its position and continued in the right direction. After passing through this zone of radio silence, Orion 1 was able to pass back around the other side of the moon and easily reestablish contact. And while doing so, it captured an incredible sight, an inverse of what we see here on Earth, an Earthrise, further tests, and re-entry. Then it was time for more tests, including one of my favorites, the sloshing test. Fluid mechanics are complicated. Predicting how liquids like engine fuel will move under acceleration needs advanced computer models, even on Earth. But once you add the complexity of changing gravity levels, it almost becomes easier to just go up to space and watch. NASA was very interested in how much and in what ways the fuel on board Orion 1 would move under thrust, otherwise known as sloshing. This would provide valuable data that could be used to predict how much Orion 1's thrusters might be needed to perform various space maneuvers. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, Orion 1 performed its delicate lunar orbits. During these complicated maneuvers, Orion 1's thrusters were tested intensely. It needs mathematical precision to navigate the fine line between crashing into the moon's surface and flying off into space. Without thrusters that performed exactly as needed, when needed, Orion 1 would not have enough fuel to complete its trip, even with the extra supplies it carried. As it happened, Orion 1 performed more efficiently than expected. Its thruster burns were exactly what NASA had hoped for. It was able to perform its second lunar flyby, passing as close as 130 kilometers from the moon's surface. While many things went well, there were problems too. On day 8, for reasons that are still unclear, Orion 1 lost communications with Earth for 47 minutes. On top of that, on day 19, power temporarily went out to the ship's heaters and propulsion subsystems. Luckily, NASA was able to restore these systems. The second stage of its journey was complete. The final stage, re-entry, was all that was left. Could Orion survive re-entering Earth's atmosphere? To make the process simpler, Orion would only try to bring its crew module home. This detached itself from the rest of Orion and dropped towards the planet. To ease its way into the atmosphere, Orion's crew module performed a skipping maneuver, similar to how you might skim rocks across a body of water. This dip and bounce technique slowed its speed, allowing it to try to land at its desired location with greater precision. Still, temperatures became so hot during re-entry that the friction turned the air around Orion 1 into plasma. Orion 1 temporarily lost radio contact. NASA had expected this, but they still had to wait with bated breath as Orion's autonomous systems worked to stabilize its entry and as its new heat-resistant exterior plating tried to protect its residents within. At 2,900 meters above sea level, traveling at over 200 kilometers h-reach, Orion's parachutes began to deploy. First 3 smaller ones to remove the bay doors, next 2 drogue parachutes meant to begin slowing Orion's arrival, and a minute later, the main parachute. Together, these parachutes slowed Orion 1's entry to the point where a human on board could survive it. On December 11th, Orion 1 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, activating a wide array of signal beacons. It called for someone to get it. It was the USS Portland that came to collect it. Scientists waited for a couple of hours while the outer casing cooled. This also allowed them to perform even more tests, this time on how the salt water of the sea affected various Orion 1 systems, and an evaluation of how it had fared at resisting the heat of re-entry. Analysis of that is still ongoing, but the first results look positive. The passengers inside were not cooked by the 2,800 re-entry temperatures. We are also waiting for data from NASA about the radiation sensors on the mannequins themselves. But they had done it. They had run their race. The data generated by the Artemis 1 mission would be key in allowing astronauts to stand on the surfaces of worlds other than our own again. Humanity's quest to reach ever further frontiers continues. For Orion 1, its part in this ever-developing journey was complete. The Apollo program, a legendary part of human scientific history, remains a high-water mark to this day. We have never gone beyond some of the achievements set by the Apollo missions. It is still the only program to ever send a human past low Earth orbit. With recent pushes by some nations to put people back on the moon as early as 2024, it seems like a good time to look back at humanity's first giant leap to our nearest celestial neighbor. But what drove humanity to visit the moon in the first place, and what did we find out once we got there? There is much to explore. The program included 12 crewed flights and more than a dozen uncrewed ones. There were difficulties, technological advances, successes, and tragedies. Join us as we investigate the first steps in putting a human on the moon with the Apollo program, the introduction to this new series I'm planning on this incredible group of missions. The genesis of the Apollo program, Cold War context. NASA's Apollo program was, and still is, the single biggest research and development project ever undertaken by a nation in peacetime. At its highest point, NASA employed 400,000 people, used the help of 20,000 different industrial companies and universities, and made up 4.4% of the entire U.S. government's budget. Since nowadays, NASA only gets about 0.5% of the U.S. government's spending, this brings up an important question. Why was the U.S. so focused on reaching this goal? First, we need to understand a bit of the background that led to the creation of the Apollo program, and that starts with the Cold War. After World War II, tensions started to rise between the two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each trying to prove their nation was better. This was more than just a rivalry between two competing nations, though. Because of deep political differences, each saw the other's success as a direct threat to their own way of life. America feared that if the Soviet Union got too far ahead, it could mean the end of capitalism and democracy, while the USSR was worried that if it didn't outdo America, it could mean the end of the communist dream. Each side looked at the other with great suspicion, and each was determined that they would not be left behind. And so it was with great shock to the American people that on October 4, 1957, the USSR successfully launched the first ever artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 weighed 83 kilo, 8 times bigger than any satellite the U.S. was thinking of launching, and it circled the Earth 1,140 times during the 3 months it stayed in orbit. By sending signals to and from it, Soviet scientists were able to use it to get information about the density of Earth's upper atmosphere and its ionosphere. The rocket that launched Sputnik 1 was called the R-7 and could produce 4.4 million newtons of thrust. American rockets, in comparison, could only produce 670,000 newtons of thrust. This breakthrough worried the American people for 2 reasons. First, in a time when the threat of nuclear war was always present, knowing that an enemy nation had access to such powerful rockets made Americans feel unsafe. It seemed very possible that such rockets could carry nuclear bombs instead of scientific ones, a valid fear, as the R-7 was designed with a nuclear payload in mind. Until that point, the U.S. had never worried about such attacks on its home soil because of its geographical distance from other nations. But beyond that, Americans were worried that the Soviet Union was making greater progress than them in science and technology. Kennedy's challenge and NASA's expansion. To calm the public, the then unelected President Kennedy campaigned on a promise that he would make sure America was superior to the USSR in space technology. When he was successfully elected, he started looking for ways to keep this promise, and was shocked when he found out how much it would cost. But when the USSR reached another space milestone on April 12, 1961, by sending the first human into space, President Kennedy started asking his researchers what they could do to match or beat Soviet progress. The answer came on April 20th of that same year. If they wanted to beat the Soviet Union, who were already ahead in the space race thanks to their powerful R-7 rockets, they would need to aim for something that was currently beyond the abilities of both nations. The suggested target was an internationally ambitious one designed to impress the world. NASA would put a man on the moon. This challenge would require big improvements to America's existing rocket technology, They would need to produce 50 times as much force to lift all the rocketry and modules needed to get a person to the moon and back. NASA would also need a much bigger budget, which was quickly approved. In 1961, NASA was given $744 million for its various projects. Just a few years later, as the budget needs grew, NASA was getting over $5 billion per year. NASA started using these funds to grow its operations, building new launch sites and mission control centers, hiring new staff, and getting research and development equipment, like vacuum chambers that could almost simulate a perfect vacuum. The Lunar Orbit Rendezvous strategy NASA had already been thinking about how to land a man on the moon in early 1960. But with this new influx of money and political motivation, they began to seriously tackle the problem. Different plans were made to outline how to achieve a lunar landing. Should they build one huge rocket that would fly directly to the moon and back again in a plan called direct descent? Or maybe an Earth orbit rendezvous might be a better choice, where over the course of up to 15 rocket launches, different spacecraft parts could be carried up to and put together in space. There were various problems with these plans. First, a rocket simply flying straight to the moon and back again would be incredibly heavy and would need amazing lift. It would have to carry enough fuel to get out of both the Earth's and Moon's orbits, and this much extra weight was even further beyond the USA's existing rocket capabilities. The second idea, the Earth Orbit Rendezvous, to build a rocket in space, was also a problem. It would get around the lift issue, as carrying only part of a spacecraft would be much lighter for each individual rocket. But launching so many rockets would massively increase the overall costs and complexity of the project, as each rocket launch would cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and putting a spacecraft together in space would be no easy task either. Finally, NASA decided on a plan that could use the best parts of both. Their idea was to create a rocket that would separate, with a mission plan they called the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. The rocket would carry two modules, a capsule-like command module and another part called the lunar module, out of Earth's orbit. These two modules would travel together to the moon. The lunar module, which was much smaller than the overall rocket, would detach from the command module and take astronauts down to the surface. Once they were there, it would bring them back up again to meet up with the command module. Once all the astronauts and samples were moved back to the command module would travel alone back to Earth before finally splashing down in the ocean. It seems a bit complicated, but it was hoped to be the most economical model, both in terms of cost and in terms of weight thrust needs. With this plan in place, NASA could begin building and testing. They would need to create rockets that were much larger and more powerful than anything they had ever made before. They would need to send their own astronauts into space and thoroughly test each stage of the journey to make sure the program was a success. But they were on their way. The Apollo program had started. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Just as with Isaac Newton, the Apollo program did not stand alone. Its successes would not have been possible if it weren't for the vital missions that came before it and ran alongside it. It built on the knowledge gained from those missions, expanded on their technology, and used the expertise of the people who worked on them. Join us today as we look at two of those essential early programs, Project Mercury and Project Gemini, and investigate how they helped a young NASA gain a better understanding of how to put a man on the moon. NASA as an institution has not been around forever. It was only started in 1958 in response to the Soviet Union launching the Sputnik satellite about a year earlier. But it's not entirely correct to say that NASA was completely new even in 1958. When U.S. President Eisenhower signed off on the creation of NASA, he did so by combining several programs and institutions that already existed. There was the NACA, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the U.S. Army's Ballistic Missile Agency, and German scientists who had worked on ballistic missiles for Germany during World War II. Beyond that, the U.S. Air Force had been working on a Man in Space Soonest, or MISS program, which was also given to NASA along with some of their facilities. These, along with other government projects, provided the foundation for NASA. But among all of these, there wasn't a way to get a human into orbit. The closest was the X-15 program of NACA. This airplane was able to skim the edges of space and in the early 1960s broke records by flying to a height of 105 kilometers and reaching speeds of over 6,000 km/h. A later X-15 reached 7,200 km/h and holds the record to this day for the fastest crude-powered aircraft. But while this was above the Kármán line of 100 kilometers, or the FAI's, Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, definition of space, this truly represents the limit of an airplane. Something more would need to be developed to get a human into orbit and eventually to the moon. Project Mercury, the first steps into space. And so NASA started its first project to properly send a human into space, Project Mercury. Project Mercury's mission was a continuation of the Man in Space Soonest program, and as that name suggests, its goal was to get a man into orbit and back safely, preferably before the Soviet Union. This would not be an easy task. Riding a rocket into space meant an astronaut would have to deal with G-forces, intense vibrations, the risk of explosion from riding on what was essentially a repurposed missile, and the threat of catastrophic burning up on re-entry. Scientists also worried about radiation once an astronaut left the atmosphere, and even micrometeoroids hitting the ship. While some of these threats turned out to be minor, the odds of being hit by a meteor turned out to be very small. The rest were very real dangers to human life. The rockets NASA used for Project Mercury were the Redstone rocket, which was later replaced by the Atlas rocket. Both of these rockets were originally designed as missiles. The Redstone was a direct descendant of the German V-2 rocket, developed for wartime use. When the Second World War ended, America brought German scientists over and put them to work developing American weapons and technology. Werner von Braun, a German scientist brought over in this way, became a chief engineer at NASA and was key in helping develop the rocket technology for Project Mercury and later Apollo. The idea was for a launch vehicle to carry a pod up to a height of 161 kilometers, shedding boosters and unneeded sections along the way. The pod would orbit the Earth, reaching as high as 280 kilometers at the highest point in its orbit before using its boosters to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. After surviving the frictional heat of re-entry, which reached temperatures as high as 1,600 degrees, parachutes would open and slow the pod's landing in the ocean, where it would be picked up. Boosters would need to jettison at the right time to keep the weight down. This didn't always happen. They were experimenting with new ablative heat shields. Instead of completely stopping heat absorption, ablative heat shields soaked up a large amount of heat and then burned it off as a gas, carrying the extra heat with it. Obviously, if you miscalculated how much heat shield you would need, your craft would run out and you'd burn up. Redundancies would need to be built into the rocket in case of a malfunction. While there was a human on board, a rocket-powered escape vehicle was built into the spacecraft as a kind of ejector seat. The whole process had to be thoroughly tested before they could try a crewed mission. The first attempt in August 1959 did not go well. Because of an incorrectly installed power plug, The first Mercury Redstone rocket, known as Little Joe 1, only lifted about 4 inches off the ground before settling back down on the launch pad. Future launches had mixed results. Von Braun did 20 tests in all between 1959 and 1961. Most of these tests were not crewed, except for a few where trained monkeys and chimpanzees were in the pod. Von Braun wanted absolute certainty of success before letting a human fly in one of his rockets. While his caution was excellent scientific practice, it came at a price. In April 1961, Russia beat America to the punch by successfully launching astronaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit, making him the first man in space. Von Braun's first human launch came 1 month later with astronaut Alan Shepard, although this was still only a suborbital flight. Score 2 for the Russians. They got the first satellite into space, and now the first human into orbit, and the U.S. was worried. Project Mercury ultimately launched 6 human flights, 2 on Redstone rockets, and 4 on Atlas rockets, all of which were successful. And although they didn't get into space soonest, as had been their goal, they learned incredibly important things about launching rockets, enduring space, and surviving re-entry. Project Gemini, mastering orbital maneuvers. But when NASA announced the Apollo program in 1960 with its plan to reach the moon, it became clear that much more knowledge would be needed. Mercury's final mission had sent an astronaut into space for a day and a half, but a trip to the moon and back would take 8 days. Also, NASA decided that the best way to reach the moon would be to use the lunar orbit rendezvous method. This plan required performing perhaps the most difficult maneuver in space travel, docking with another object in orbit. They hadn't even done this around Earth yet, let alone the moon. The lunar orbit rendezvous method involved a lunar module detaching from a command and service module, landing on the moon, then rejoining the command and service module, which would then bring all the astronauts back to Earth. Astronauts would also need to practice doing spacewalks in case work on the outside of a spacecraft became necessary during the trip. And finally, more practice would be needed with re-entry techniques, particularly landing at a pre-selected spot on land, although in the Apollo missions, this last idea was eventually dropped. On top of that, the Soviet Union was ahead, and America needed to catch up. So while the Apollo team got to work developing its rockets and modules, these extra challenges were given to a supporting mission to solve. The mission was named Project Gemini. Project Gemini, which launched 12 missions between 1961 and 1966, built on the foundations of Project Mercury. The Gemini capsule was basically a bigger version of the one used on Mercury, now able to hold a crew of 2. The rocket used was a Titan II, another adapted military missile redesigned for a new purpose of discovery. Gemini also saw an expansion of the technology from Project Mercury. The Mercury spacecraft could do little to change its direction once it reached orbit. If a space rendezvous was to happen, this would need to change. The Gemini spacecraft was equipped with an orbit attitude and maneuvering system to allow it to change its orbit and orientation while in space. The Gemini spacecraft was also developed to be able to support a crew in space for longer. By the launch of Gemini 5, astronauts were able to spend a whole week in space. To play it safe in later flights, this time was extended to 14 days by Gemini 7, 6 more days than would be needed for a trip to the moon. While there was a lot of success with these missions, there were also some scares. Neil Armstrong flew on Gemini 8. The purpose of this mission was to rendezvous with and dock with an uncrewed Agena target vehicle, which had been launched earlier. The first part of the mission went smoothly, with the docking being a success. But while Armstrong and his co-pilot David Scott were still in the target vehicle, they noticed that the ship had started spinning in space. This could be catastrophic. If the spinning ship hit their Gemini craft while the two tried to undock, it could cause fatal damage to their craft. Also, they were not exactly sure why the craft was spinning. If a thruster was firing when it shouldn't be, it would be using valuable fuel that was needed to orient themselves correctly for re-entry. If they were not facing the right way, the heat shield would not protect them from the incredible heat generated. The two astronauts worked quickly, and by firing one of the opposing thrusters, they were able to slow the two crafts enough that they could get back into the Gemini craft and just barely undock safely. They then realized that it had been one of the Gemini craft's thrusters that had been firing. Both astronauts were close to losing consciousness. However, they managed to fix the fault, and using the re-entry thrusters, Armstrong calmly brought the craft back under control, stopping its tumble. He managed it with only 30% fuel remaining. Moments like this reinforced the importance of being able to perform EVAs, extravehicular activities, or spacewalks. And so Gemini also included missions where astronauts practiced going outside of their spacecraft to perform checks. Buzz Aldrin set the record for this, performing a 5-hour, 30-minute spacewalk, proving that with proper rests, work outside of a spacecraft was indeed possible. This also gave engineers ideas on ways they could make it easier, such as installing handholds at certain places on the craft. All in all, it was through the work of Gemini and Mercury that the foundation was laid. Thanks to the discoveries made on both of these programs, NASA was making significant strides in its objectives to reach the moon. It also began to close the gap between itself and Russia. It would now be up to Apollo to take the final steps,